Welcome everyone to another edition of Annex Show. Happy to have this again. And so my name is Juri Strumpflohner. I'm the Director of Developer Experience here at Narwhal. And today I have with me Colum, which is a coworker of mine. Colum, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, sure. Hey, I'm Colum. I'm a senior engineer at Narwhal, and I work mostly on the Angular vertical within NX.
Cool. So today, as we mentioned in the title, we wanted to go a bit into the topic of module federation, maybe standalone components, or do some experimentation around it. So I think that we got like the two biggest, let's say, hype topic, or at least like hot topic, let's say in the community, in the Angular community. Even some controversial discussions recently about the new APIs around standalone components and stuff. Which I think is very important, like just to take that up at the very beginning. Have these discussions, and I really like the way the Angular team recently approached this by having also this kind of developer preview of the standalone component and kind of give it to the community. It will mostly be like that in the end, right? It will not change dramatically, but have them experiment, have them discuss, because that's how you can involve the broader community much more, right? Cool. So yeah, I think like just to open the topic a bit, let's start with the modular federation aspect of things, right? So we hear a lot of modular federation, micro front ends. Maybe you can speak a bit to it. Like, what is modular federation? How, like, in which context are we in when we talk about those things?
Yeah, so with module federation, it tends to be about how we load chunks of JavaScript into your application. Normally with Webpack, it gets bundled into multiple chunks of JavaScript files that all get hosted in the same location, side by side. And then when you need a new chunk for lazy loading a file or something like that, it will pull it just from the same location as the rest of the application. But with module federation, those JavaScript files, those chunks could actually be in like a separate domain, could be in a separate location altogether from the application that's actually trying to load them. So module federation gives us this ability to load remote modules and chunks.
Yeah, nice. And how do they relate to the whole micro front-end topic, right? Because very often, especially like with the Webpack field, right? Because Webpack is one implementation of the whole module federation thing, right? So we often talk about the Webpack module federation, and very often that comes up in the context of the whole micro front-ends as well. So maybe we can also shed some light on that aspect.
Yeah, so like micro front ends is like the concept of having multiple small applications that are composed together into one single application. And those the micro front ends of smaller applications tend to be in different domains, run by different teams, completely autonomous teams that are deploying to their own location. They make multiple deploys without having to impact any other team that's building an application. So the concept and the technology behind module federation helps to allow this, due to how it lets you load JavaScript chunks essentially natively as you would normally do it, except from a different location than when the app is hosted. So it fits very well into that architectural pattern.
Cool. And in the whole NX setup, we tried to dive into that area a bit, right? So I don't remember. I think like in April in the NX 14 release, that kind of hit, or at least like the complete package kind of hit in that release, right? Where we introduced module federation a bit more, and we separated, as far as I know, like between like, okay, you just use module federation, or you use like module federation for the purpose of creating micro front ends within like an NX workspace.
Yeah.
So maybe you can talk about to that, like how can you use them separately, and what's the purpose of using them separately, and so on.
Yeah, so the way we looked at module federation was that it could have two use cases. We could look at it as a way of implementing micro front ends, or we could look at it in potentially a more clever manner, which is like taking one application and splitting it into vertical slices, which can then be used for incremental building. So then we could have these slices that can be built once and then cached. And when we go to build the main application, we just pull a lot of the smaller minor applications, the vertical slices. I don't like to call them applications because then the term gets confusing. So those vertical slices can be cached, and then when we go to build, we're just pulling from the cache when we're building the main application.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, to me, like when we pushed out that feature and when I played around with it and tried out a couple of different variations, and actually we also wrote up a blog post about how you can do that, right? So which will be most of the topic which you go through today. But like if people are curious, there is a blog post, and you can find it if you go to our blog now.io and /Angular. There's like all the Angular specific ones listed, where you will also find the one about module federation. But yeah, to come back to that, like for me, the module federation setup that we kind of proposed in NX kind of went full circle, right? Because that really leveraged, like not just like for the whole code splitting aspect, because a lot of people argue like, well, you could do it with lazy loaded routes, right? But it's not quite the same, right? Because one problem that you run into is specifically the application build itself, right? Because that takes a long, or if you have like a really huge application, like that takes a whole lot of time to produce. And since it's like one single build, you can cache that one single build, right? But the cache will not really help you kind of improve that aspect as the application grows, right? So you have potentially that bottleneck where as the application gets bigger and bigger, your build kind of times go up. And so your production deployment times go up because like you have to wait for that huge build to succeed. Yeah. And yeah, as you said, like the incremental area there, the incremental builds that we introduced a while back, I think like a year back or even more, don't really help because that's just at the library level. You still have that linking aspect in the end, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like the module federation kind of brought all those different topics kind of together, where now you have the advanced capabilities of like the generators that can help you set it up, because it's not that trivial to set up, like especially if you start with it and you have no clue about it, right? Yeah. But then like you also have the caching that supports you then once you have it set up, right? And potentially can add that incremental building of just building the single libraries in addition to that as well.
Yeah.
Cool, but I would like to probably dive into it, and maybe we can like just directly have a look at some actual code, right? And how that setup works, and specifically the generators that we mentioned, like have a bit of a closer look of what those look like. Do you want to share?
Sure. Yeah, I can share my screen. Okay, let me know if you can see it. Okay, so I have an empty NX workspace here, which has the Angular preset set up. And we've made generators to make this very easy to set up like module federated applications, where it's just host application, and then you can define what remotes you may want for this. So I'll just call it remote 1 for here for now. And that will ask you for your style sheet, and then it will generate all the files needed for the 2 applications, and it'll also set up some end-to-end applications. And if we take a look at what was actually generated for the remote application, we will see.
Can we maybe explain before we go ahead, like for those that have never maybe touched the whole module federation aspect, like what's the difference between host and remote, right? Like here it's just 2 apps basically, right? As far as understood. So we just named them host and remote. But what's the concept like about in module federation?
Yeah, so in module federation, your host application or your shell application is the main entry point to your application. Like that's the one that most users are going to visit on when it's deployed. And the remote applications then are your micro front ends or your federated modules that the host application depends on. So it needs to be able to import those into its application so that it can render them and perform the logic necessary.
Mm-hmm. So basically, like if you talk in the form of like Angular patterns, it could be like the host can be seen as well your main application simply, and the remotes are kind of like the lazy loaded routes potentially, right, which get pulled in. With the difference though that the remote is a fully standalone application by itself, right? So you could potentially just load that single one.
Yes,
probably depends on the setup you have, but you could, right?
Yeah, no, that's it exactly. So you could think of it like in the domain-driven approach, where your remote could be a full domain within your overall application. It could be like the admin side, or it could be the product side, things like that.
Cool.
Okay, so if I take a look at what is actually generated for a remote application, we get this module federation configuration file, and on this we simply just expose the necessary entry module, which is just an ng module that's being exposed. So this is what creates a chunk that can be loaded by the host application. And we can see that the host application has a module federation configuration file too, and it just says it depends on a remote named remote 1. We have a helper in our webpack config called with module federation, that can find this configuration, what is exposed. Now, the entry module itself, as I mentioned, is just an ng module, declares a couple of components, and it has a router module set up to allow for routing, and it routes to the entry component, which is just a very standard Angular component, a template and a selector. On the host side, the host's app module will be set up to have a route, which will route to the remote application. So remote one, and we import the path. So this remote one / module is defined by the remote module federation configuration file. So this exposes this key here, this / module, is where we set up the path for the remote route, for the import path, for the lazy loaded route. And then remote one, because that's the name of the application that we're loading, it becomes the path, the import path for us. And it's just like any other standard lazy loaded remote or ng module feature at that stage.
So you really just plug in here now the remote module, rather than you would go, for instance, I don't know, in NX is often the case also that you have that remote loaded from a library, right, where that is the entry point. So in this case, it's just like separated out in basically an application or something.
Yeah, so you normally see something like this, where you would import it from the library locally in NX, but in our use case, we're importing it from this remote. Now, TypeScript usually will throw an error here at this stage because this doesn't exist. It doesn't know what this path is. So the other thing the generator will do is create a remotes.dts file, which will just declare this module, because we know it will exist at runtime because of the Webpack module federation that's happening at build time. So if I was to quickly show this being served now, we can just run an xserve host, and it will use a custom builder that we've built, because it will find the remote application and it will build it. So it needs to have the built JavaScript files, the built artifact available. And then once that's done, it will spin up a HTTP server to host it on a separate port, which will act as like our different location. So you can see here where we've got it loaded at 4201. And then our host application will build, and the Webpack dev server from Angular's dev server builder will then kick in and host it with live reload and things like that are necessary. So if we go to localhost, you can see our host has been loaded, and we have this remote one on a link in the left-hand side, If I open up my network tab.
Can you bump that up a bit so we can see? Like if you, awesome, yeah, perfect.
I click on remote one, it'll perform a lazy loaded route to the JavaScript file. And if we take an even closer look at it, we will see that it actually pulled that from the different domain, from the different host. And it just works as expected. It just renders it with no issues.
So meaning also that if you go like to 4201, I think it was, like there's the other application running independently. So remote one is running there, right? Yeah, exactly. So potentially you can serve that individually, right? And just run it in isolation.
Yep, exactly. So that's the module federation with the generators at its most basic form. And you can see it takes care of a lot for you and provides us a lot of benefits. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to set that up manually.
So one thing I want to highlight, and then like I saw that Lars has a question in the chat, which I'll bring up in a second. Like one thing I wanted to highlight here is that what we like, as I mentioned before, like what you often see in that host application is lazy loading happening by pulling in functionalities from the libs folder, right? It's like the whole like advantage also of an NX workspace. If you're not having the monorepo scenario, it can also just be able to split up your logic into those libs folders to have like one per domain basically, right? And lazy loading pulls them into the main application. Now in this setup which you created, and you brought it up before, right? Where you mentioned like every remote could potentially be like one of those domains, and that separate domain application I'm pulling in those libraries from the libs folder, right?
Yeah.
So that could be potentially a scenario. And it's actually something that comes up very often because like if you have that, not just for the build times, right, but also for local serve times. Because if you have a large application and have a lot of teams working on it, what often happens is people are like, oh, I'm working on that checkout phase of my shop application, right? And so I don't want to serve the products page. I don't need it. Or I don't want to serve like maybe the contacts page or the orders page, right? I really want just my local domain and serve that quickly and as quickly as possible. And so local serve times have kind of been an issue sometimes if you have super large Angular applications, right?
Yeah.
And so here, that can help as well, right?
Yep.
Like the
So I can
monitoration
actually,
side.
yeah, if I generate a new remote, and we'll call it, this is called products page, products. So we can keep better track of this. We can say that the host is going to be the host application.
So this basically now creates an equivalent to remote one, right?
Yep.
And the dash host, what does it do?
The dash host will link the products application, the remote up, to the host application, so we can see it automatically added the products into that array in the configuration file. And if we take a look at the app module, we'll see that it created a new products here. It either TypeScript hasn't added the remotes or the TypeScript language server.
Be up to date probably.
Yeah, so it is here. Let me remember how to do this. I'll reset the TS server.
Yeah, read us. Yeah, exactly.
So it just adds an lazy loaded route to the app module so that we can then route to that. I think it should have added a new link. It has. So just to double check everything there. This will be slightly interesting because we should get a cache hit, as we can see, and actually the output from cache. So we got the cache hit for remote 1. And
because
now
we ran
it will build,
before, right?
Yep, exactly. And there's no changes to it. And then it will build products, and then it will rebuild host and serve it. So if we can see the new route, we can click on it, loads correctly. However, if you did have to work on products at the minute, if we were to make a change in the products application, so let's just say the template here, if we added the world, we come back here, we won't see any change on the products page at all. That's because it's being served statically at the moment. So it's not picking up any changes. It's not live reloading the products section. So we have an option that we can pass to host, which is dev remotes, and that can say, okay, we want to also live serve products. Again, we get the cache hit from remote 1, get served statically. We'll now serve both the products and the host using the Webpack dev server. So if we reload, we can see hello world down here. If we were to make a change to this, we can see that it automatically changed in our browser. Hello, Juri. So,
yeah.
So we can still get that.
The reason for all that is the caching aspect, right? Because like before we just use a static server, because potentially that output, as has happened for remote 1, right, came from some cache location, right? So it was just pulled out by the NX computation cache. And then it's just a HTTP server on top of that.
Yeah. And it becomes super powerful when you combine that with like distributed caching, because if there's multiple teams working in different areas within the full application, then if you're only working in one area and you've pulled the latest, you'll likely just get a cache hit from the other team's work. So you never have to rebuild something that another team is working on at that stage.
Yeah, I think the big advantage, like, first of all, I think it's the main concept to understand here that is new, is that now basically with such a setup, for instance, like what it changed basically to the setup that you have now with those 2 remotes rather than having everything in one app and just lazy loaded, right? So in the lazy loaded version, you just have one big chunk to build at the end, right? Even if you pre-built the libraries before, you have the linking phase of Webpack at the top that kind of bundles everything together. And now what we did is basically go a step further, where we slice also the app, like that big chunk, into individual pieces, such that like each of them can be cached individually, right? So that is mainly the main purpose behind the scenes. And the advantage, obviously, as you have shown here, is that we could obviously just load remote one, let's say, like just serve that one, not even using some sort of modification or everything, just load that one and develop with that one. But at the same time, here in this setup, we can load everything, but just like load, let's say, remote one, which I'm working on in dev mode, and therefore still get a lot of speed benefits, but seeing it into the context of the whole application, we're still right.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily have to pay that.
Yeah, and that can be very beneficial too for any applications that use some kind of like app initializer, which will do some kind of like authentication requests or get fetch permissions or do A/B testing, that it sets up certain feature flags and things like that. Because you at that stage you don't have to copy that setup into every single application within your full setup.
Yeah.
You can have it in the host application, and then you just serve the host application and point to the section, the vertical slice of the application that you're working on, and just have that one be live reloaded.
Cool. So one thing I think, like, we can go into some of the questions that have come up, like in the chat. And first of all, there's a very specific one from Lars, which mentioned that some migration of us like renamed MFE to ME.
ME or MF?
MF probably, I think, but that would make sense. ME, that would be weird. If that's the case, Lars, then it's probably a bug. But can you talk to like the MF? Did we change that?
We did. We migrated everything from MFE to MF because we didn't want the focus to be about micro frontends. The focus now is module federation. We feel like module federation gives you 95% of the benefits that micro frontends give you, without the added complexity of having autonomous teams that need to have independent deployments, that have versioning issues between different versions that are deployed. Whereas module federation, we do have to look at as one application that has been split into vertical slices, but it's still overall, it's one application. Whereas micro frontends is a composition of multiple applications. So we wanted to make that a very definitive change so that we're focusing on module federation and that the module federation technology.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because, as we mentioned at the very beginning of the show, like this is often very intermixed, right? Like people talk about module federation and micro frontends in the same context, and it's fair enough. Like they come like to play in the same context, so it makes sense that a lot of them kind of just mix them together and that setup. But I also see it kind of as different levels of potentially optimizing, right? Like you can start with just the caching, the affected commands with the NX on CI, and like try to optimize your build setup with that. Maybe add DT on top, which NX Cloud offers. But then if that isn't enough, and specifically as we mentioned, the local dev time serving kind of suffers because it's so slow, right? Then you can add like the MF setup, like the module federation setup on top. And then if you really need that additional complexity of being able to deploy completely independently, maybe even use different versions and stuff, so really go into that complexity. Well, then on top of that, you can obviously construct like the microfront setup, as you said.
Yeah, exactly.
And Lars mentioned like that he was intending MF basically as the microfront. There's another question that came up that we may be able to address is, how would NGRX work with MFE or in a module federation setup?
So it should work as expected. Our helper will detect any libraries that are being used in both the host application and all the remote applications, and it will share it at a specific version. And it does that intentionally because with Angular, with the dependency injection and the injector hierarchy, if they aren't on the same version or they aren't shared, then we can get the null injector error because it doesn't exist because it will create a new injection tree when we load a new remote up into the shell. So if we share them all, we can make sure that there's no injection issues there. And because of that, the NGRX should continue to work. There's always a question around how to then architect the actual store itself. But again, that's something that's going to have to be answered mostly by the teams themselves. Like, how would they want to create their structure for their stores?
Yeah, makes sense. Another question that came from Chao. Hey, Chao. There's a question from the Vietnam community, which he's also leading. So remote one uses Tailwind while the host doesn't have Tailwind set up. So what are the available strategies?
Yeah, so that's a known issue because Tailwind has to collect all the classes that are being used. At that stage, there's not much that you can do except to have Tailwind at least in the host as well, so that it can collect the secondary points. Because of a module federation setup, the host will have an implicit dependency on remote one and products. In this example, there's a helper that we have. It's like I can't remember what it's called, but it's part of our Tailwind generator, which will go through all the dependencies within the host and will analyze it to pull the class names out, so it can do that pruning properly and have the create the CSS bundle that then gets used by remote one.
Yeah, that one mainly collect basically all the glob patterns, right? To where Tailwind does the purging in the end. Because you could always just include everything, but that would not be super performant, right? If you have a large workspace. In a small one, you probably wouldn't notice. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think in a module federation setup where your own purpose is really just to speed up the application and create those buildable and cacheable chunks of the app itself, I feel like the problem would be less of an issue, because at that point you probably have a common styling, because it's really just as if you have one app. You just split it up for the purpose of the speed, right? Or independent serving and local serving and stuff, right? In an MFE setup, like in a micro frontend setup, that could definitely happen. So yeah, definitely good question.
On the micro frontend setup, you could probably create some kind of onload function that would then pull the CSS file from the remote application as it gets loaded into the host and attaches the link to the style sheet, to the index HTML at that stage. It's more complicated, but it should be possible.
Could be a good new show, like a next edition show. We'll dive into that one. There's another question before we go ahead that came up. So what is the best strategy for sharing a component library between different applications? So what if like remote counter app relies on one component from one component library?
Yeah, so you would just create your component library. It's probably better to actually make that component library buildable at that stage, because when one remote builds it, then the other one will just fetch the cache for it. With module federation, we like to think of it as one application for that reason, that if you change the component library, you should redeploy everything at that stage, because you're still just building one application.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Cool. So before we go ahead, one thing I also wanted to mention and bring up is that right now what we did is basically start from a new example, right? So we started from like generating a new host, generating immediately a remote, and then adding a new remote. A lot of the folks are probably also in a situation where they have an Angular app, it starts growing, and they come at that point where it's like, okay, now I am at the point where caching and also affected. It still suffers basically. I still suffer like the build speed kind of slow down on CI when I want to deploy my app. And so there's also a potential, like, is there a way, or how can we migrate an existing application to a module federation setup?
Yeah. So if I just generate one here quickly, then this is just a remote that hasn't been hooked up with module federation. We do have a generator called setupmf. If I just type help in there, it takes the application name that you want to set up, asks you what type of module federation that you want to use. If it's a host type or a remote, it'll ask you the federation type. So static or dynamic, default is static. It'll ask you the port that it's served at, and then you can say there's more. If it is a host, you can tell it all the remotes that need to be linked to it, or if it's a host, you can tell which host should be consumed by it. And if you need a written setup. So if we already run that for the remote I just generated, which was remote 2, yeah, and we say that its MF type is a remote, that its port is 4203. host is going to be host, and it does have root. Should go through and set it up for us. So you can see it updates the hosts module federation to include it. It updates the remotes DTS file, adds a new link. If we just take a look quickly at the actual code, you can see it's been added. My mouse isn't responding well. It added a new route to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we take a look at the actual remote 2, we can see that it created a module federation config, which exposes the entry module. It will create the entry module file for us.
Mm-hmm. And points to that one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I feel like a lot of the folks will most likely, unless you already know from the very beginning to go in that direction, but the more realistic case I feel is that you start, as mentioned, that you come to that limit where then you're searching for a solution. That modification can actually be a way to speed up both your CI and local serve time. So if people are interested, and that's also why I linked that YouTube link there, we keep publishing new videos and tutorials on YouTube. And I'm going to drop a link soon in the chat as well, and you will find it in the show notes later, where we did exactly that. So where we registered a video tutorial that walks through like an existing application with lazy loaded libraries, and then restructures everything such that basically you have now a module federation setup where all of these different domains are basically separated out into different remotes, and those then load those lazy loaded libraries. So it's not like, obviously it's a kind of constructed example, but it kind of goes step by step through the process of what you would have to apply in a real world scenario.
Yeah.
So definitely check that out. Cool. Let's jump over to our second part of the topic. So another one that we have in the title is like standalone components. So what are standalone components? Can you maybe talk about that or show something, or
so standalone components are basically the concept that a component no longer needs to be declared in an ng module. So it's the transition away from having ng modules in your application to just having components that can be created on their own without having that ng module needed to provide providers and imports and declarables and exports and things like that. So they can then be used on their own and imported into other standalone components or into other ng modules if you're transitioning between one approach to the other.
Cool. Yeah, I was waiting for that API, to be honest, for years. Like, since I think everyone that ever either is a library author or has some lazy loaded dialogues or something that you need to pull in, like having something like, or even in general, like some lazy loaded like pieces that you want to embed like in an Angular application. Being able to like have those standalone components is much more straightforward. And specifically, like I started with Angular 2. Like I started with Angular 1, but I already experimented with like the 2.0 beta, I don't know, 15 or something, where it was still without ng modules, right? And I was like, oh, this actually feels pretty good. It's kind of different, but it feels pretty good because you just like within the component decorator, you specify whatever you need, and that gets pulled in. And like, I mean, like, it was kind of a mind shift from going from Angular 1, which kind of had those modules, right, where you bundle things together. But it felt good. And then it like goes back. So I feel like going back full circle now, coming to a point where you get rid of the ng modules again. Although that might not happen. I mean, we still don't know. It might be like very like further down the road at some point.
I think it'll be years before we see the ng modules being ripped out. They'll be supported for a long time because a lot of applications still depend on them currently.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's the main thing, right? First of all, there's the part about like, okay, you learn Angular this way, right? So you're kind of in that mindset of like how you build Angular applications, how you structure them, because you have that concept of a module, which, to be honest, like to teach, because I did a lot of like in-person workshops and stuff at companies, to teach people like the concept of a module, that was always super painful, especially for people that come from a background scenario where you introduce them to like the whole ESM modules and like, what is a JavaScript module, right? And then you come like, well, there's another type of module on top of that, which is like the Angular modules, right? And so there's a lot of confusion around that, and that was definitely painful. So I'm kind of looking, like part of me is kind of looking forward to that, and where you're like, well, you group them just as you would any other JavaScript app, right? So you have maybe some kind of barrel file where you export, like where you handle the visibility. And I mean, from the MNX perspective, you can already do that in a very nice manner, right? Because if you separate things out into libraries, you can perfectly control what is exposed and what not, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which
you can create
within
kind
of exactly. So within a like more monolithic Angular CLI setup, that might be harder because it's just folders basically separating you from importing stuff, and there's not really any mechanism like lint rules or so preventing you from doing so, right?
Yeah.
So to go, and yeah, Lars also brought out that Angular newcomers are going to learn Angular without ng modules. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm very much on the same page there as well. Like at the point where you can build them from scratch up, there might like from the ground up without ng modules, and it's not really required anymore. I think new patterns, like architectural patterns, would emerge. And to be honest, as I mentioned, I as a teacher from that perspective, I would just be happy, right? Like one concept less to teach and make sure people get and to be going. But to go ahead, how do we combine those two topics? Because we mentioned in the title, right, of this show, like module federation and standalone components. So what do they give us? Do we already have some support of the standalone components in NX? Because it's still kind of a developer preview, right?
Yeah. Yes, at the moment we have some support, which has been released recently. So we can generate applications that are standalone first. We can generate libraries that are standalone first. And I have a PR up currently, which will give us host and remote generators that allow for standalone components first. That said, if we take a look at the actual standalone application, we use the generator for it. We just pass a standalone flag. And then we can take a look at some code. So one of the big things they notice they start with is that the main TS file will change quite a bit. This really does become our main entry point. I mean, like before in other Angular applications, the main entry point, you would have mostly looked at the app module. Like the main TS just bootstrapped the app module, and the app module took care of routing, it took care of any app initializers and things like that. Whereas with standalone components, we will now see everything in the main TS file, more than likely. So we've got this function that was brought out as part of the API for standalone components, bootstrap application. It takes a standalone component, and then we can provide some options. So we have this import providers from another API from standalone components, which will allow us to import, use certain module providers, I think the term is, and import the providers from those. So the router module for the for route gets set up with an empty array. Everything here is as we'd expect, just in a standard app module, except it's now wrapped in this import providers from call and the providers array of a bootstrap application at the main TS file. If we take a look at the app file, the app folder, sorry, we can see there's no app module anymore. It's not necessary. And the app component will be marked as standalone. It'll import router module so that we can get the directives the router module offers, such as like the router outlet and things like that. And then it'll also import the NX welcome component. So this is the slight difference with standalone components and ng modules, where normally we had to declare a component before we could use it, and it had to be exported from an ng module. Now we can just import the component directly into any component that needs to use it. So if we take a look at the NX welcome component, we can see that it is still the same. It is a standalone true. It imports the common module to get the things like ngf, ng4, and then the actual component, the app component, then gets bootstrapped by main.ts. We can take a look at this being served.
And I think like while it's serving, like one thing that also Lars brought up, which you kind of talked about before, right? Like how do you guarantee now encapsulation with like standalone components? Because before you handled that with ng modules, but like let's imagine like a world where you don't have ng modules anymore, right? Such in this case, like you don't have them, period, right? Unless like you import them. But I guess like at some point those will disappear as well, right? So you can just import components inside from Angular and stuff. So how do you handle that? And then Lars kind of already points towards the NX libraries, right? And I feel like we could even have a dedicated show just to go in the topic of libraries and how to create them within like an NX workspace setup, because like that is one of the main or biggest misconceptions a lot of folks get when they're like, okay, like why should I migrate from, let's say, Angular CLI to NX, right? I don't have a monorepo, but it's kind of that library support, like to be able to split out libraries and have them more fine-grained and controllable in terms of what gets exposed and what not, is kind of one of the benefits as well. So I think we should definitely have a dedicated show just go in that direction.
Yeah, but on the point about encapsulation, it comes back to the issue of just general like JavaScript import issues. Like, how do you tell an API like you can't import from this path at that stage? So with NX libraries, we can define the private and public API by having a borrow file, but within like an Angular CLI workspace, if it's everything's in the app folder, then there's nothing to stop that deep import, because you can create a borrow file, yes, for a folder, but there's still nothing to stop you importing further down like a deep import further into the folder.
Yeah, I think the big plus there,
module boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say. Yeah, you need some kind of ASLint rule that NX, for instance, ships that prevents you, because even potentially from libraries you could deep import, right? It is probably more visible because like you see that whole long path that relatively jumps out and goes in some other place, right? So it's very much more visible. But there's also the boundary rule in NX which kind of prevents doing that. So
yeah,
cool. So let's see like how, like, because you brought up the topic about module federation in combination with standalone components. So how does that look like, and what is the current implementation status there?
So if we take a look at, for example, we'll start with the remote one, and we take a look at its bootstrap.ts file. This is necessary because for module federation to initialize like shared libraries and things, we need to actually use a promise which imports the bootstrap file, which would be your standard main TS file. We can see that it's still using bootstrap module of an app module, but with standalone components, we could just change this to be the same as the bootstrap application. So if I grab that and just paste it here, the only thing we're missing now is the roots, which is easy enough to set up, but it means we can go here and we can delete app module. Not sure why that didn't work. There we go. And let's go a step further. We will delete app component. We will make entry component because it no longer needs a module. We can delete that. So we could just say entry component is going to be our literal entry component to the application. And then there was a route there. Probably don't need it. We need to mark this as standalone.
Yeah, I think the routing you would need basically if you have more pages than within that separate application, right? Then you could add it. But this kind of serves as your entry page if you want, entry page component. So
exactly, yeah. So let me do standalone true, and we'll need to import the Colum module. I've been using WebStorm that much now. I'm trying to use keyboard shortcuts for it and failing. So if we take a look now, we should, emphasis on should, be able to just run NX serve on. Oh, I needed to import. Yeah.
I think there's a lot. I feel like there's a thing that a lot of people will run into. Like once you don't have the ng modules anymore, like forget about importing the actual components that you use.
Okay, and then because we've got a custom webpack config, we need to change this. Okay, so compiled successfully. I think that runs on 42.1. No issue.
What is the ngmf remote entry one? Is that the one that we configured like in a?
Yeah. Entry components being imported. Not sure if that's going to make any difference.
Is it referenced somewhere? Like this looks like a selector at some point, right? It's being it's being tried to pull in. Like where is it? Is this one referenced in a sense of? Like, is it in a template or somewhere?
Not that I can see. No.
But it cannot find the entry component ngmf remote one entry. Is that one exact one? Like the error message?
Yeah. It's interesting. I knew something would go wrong here. I literally tried this out before it came on stream.
But you tried to build it now separately, right? Like you tried to build it directly from, like you served basically just the remote, which is the one that hosts this. And so the main config basically just, like the setup kind of would be very similar to the standalone that we generated before. Can we try to look at how that one bootstrapped it? Because there's a standalone app. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it uses main TS and it just bootstraps the app component with the router module.
And use the app component. What's it? This is.
There you go. I forgot to change the index HTML.
It didn't really happen, right? Because we served the application directly, right? Rather than pulling it in over the modification setup.
Yeah, so it's because when Angular bootstraps, it tries to find the selector in the HTML so that it can
obviously tries to pull it out there.
Yeah, it tries to mount it onto that. So it was because I forgot to change that. It's my bad. But yeah, so this is standalone component now. It's available in with the Webpack, the custom Webpack setup. But if we then go to host and do the same kind of setup, and I will change the index.html. Actually, no, it should be fine. Staying the same as it is.
Yeah, I think the main advantage can already be seen, right? Like in the sense that specifically in this setup where like your remote has the only purpose of being a part of the application kind of split out, right? With the focus or the end goal to kind of just speed up the main application builds. It is already much simpler, right? Because you don't have the whole ng module ceremony that you need to set up basically to get it going.
Yeah. So we've got our app
now
component.
basically, you're now basically refactoring, right? Like the new standalone setup that we generated to make it in a way that this becomes the new host, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So we can delete the app module from host. We can now standalone to be true again. Next welcome, we need standalone true. When I serve this and try to go to remote one, it will error, I believe. Okay, I'll just detach host remote 2 from it for now.
So you're now trying to serve the host again, like with the new module standalone setup, right? And reference the remote 2?
Yeah. So turning the host into a standalone component, and then using that to bootstrap the host application. Okay. So if we click on products, we can see that it's still working. It's all bootstrapped now as a standalone component. So it's still using module federation here with the products, which is not standalone. So even though the host is a standalone component and it's using module federation, we can
still match it basically.
Yeah, we can still load in the products, which is non-standalone. Click on remote 1. Yep, errored as expected. So that's because in the bootstrap, we're trying to load this remote entry module, which doesn't exist anymore. But we can't load children a component directly, as far as I'm aware. So in remote 1, what we can do is create a new file in the app folder called roots.ts. And we'll basically just create a root configuration. I'll export it as roots. It's an array. Path is and the component, the remote entry component. It's like pretty straightforward, pretty simple. We need to change the module federation config file to then just expose that roots file instead of our actual component. And then in the bootstrap of the host, we will say instead of loading remote entry module, we want remote roots. And because we've statically served remote 1, we need to rebuild it. What if I must? Oh, yeah. Okay, remote 1, bootstrap. We can replace this
with the one, yeah. So we just conquered
roots. But then it's included in the TS compilation. Okay, and we come back here. So back here to standalone components, the host, click on products, still works. Click on remote 1, and I've done something wrong again. To load. Why is it failed to load that?
Which one did it fail this time?
This one again. I created the roots TS file for. It attempted to load this chunk and failed.
How would this, however, like here in the remote 1, you load the remote roots, right? Which exports a set of roots. Wouldn't you need to load a component in that case? Like how
Not with standalone components. With standalone components, you can just export roots definition, and then you can lazy load that through load children.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know about that one.
Which is what I was trying to show, but I'm not 100% sure why it's not working. Included here.
Yeah, we don't have to go deep into it like and solve it right now. That's fine. I think the main takeaway from my perspective here is mostly like how you can simplify. And as I mentioned before, the simplification in the sense that if you have those single module federation pieces split up, right, where you kind of try to split your app into smaller pieces and load them in. It's much easier if you have obviously just like a simple standalone component you can load in, which serves as the entry point for all the other things that might go on in that separate application. So it might be much easier there. I think there's a good question that came up as well, which I think we should address, which is this one here, which is just in general, like in terms of module federation, like is there a mechanism to add a remote React app as a lazy loading module to a host basically, which is an Angular app without using external libraries?
Not with an NX, so it's not something we support by default. It comes into the idea behind microfrontend anarchy, which is where we start mixing and matching technologies and tools, different frameworks, and that's partially why ThoughtWorks have like moved microfrontends out of their tech radar in 2020, October 2020, I think it was.
Yeah, it could be.
Because they were noticing that people were taking it too far. They were trying to do these mix and matches, and you can do it, but should you do it is like the question that they're trying to ask here. It's like you're now mixing concerns between different teams in an organization. Things may not play well together, like the state management may not copy across. You could have an issue where a change detection in Angular kicks off a full VDOM re-render and React, or vice versa. So there's these issues
Yeah, I
that
feel this
can
goes
arise.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, I feel like this goes more in the direction of where you really want to have a micro frontend setup, right? Like a full micro frontend setup potentially, where you can say, okay, you have maybe even a completely agnostic host application, which is just purely JavaScript based with its own router, which then delegates the router to the sub apps, which it loads in via some mechanism, right? So I think that goes it definitely goes outside of the model federation setup that we kind of promote, which is purely, or mostly at least right now, for the speed aspect of things, of being able to leverage caching and local serve times. So I definitely think that goes in that direction. Cool. I think we're already slightly over time. I think it was super interesting to just dig in and experiment with some of the stuff and play around with it, even with some very new APIs. And I think that we can do that more often in the sense of even non-yet ready, fully released features of NX and dig in how they might look like and experiment around, get some early feedback, and show it to folks. Cool. So before we head off, one thing that I wanted to bring up, as you can see in the background of our banner that we put up last minute here, is NXConf, which we are going to have in person in Tempe, Arizona, in October 17th. So definitely go to nx.dev/conf and make sure you type the URL correctly, not how I did it right here. We are currently having the early bird tickets, so check that out. Like, the price will go up, I think, beginning of September. So make sure you reserve your spot and your ticket there. That would be the best occasion to talk to the next team, get your questions answered, and socialize, basically, which is the main purpose of having in-person conferences. If you are at ngconf, which is happening next week, almost half of the company of Novel, I think, and a lot of NX Core team members are there. We have a booth there. We are sponsoring ngconf. We have a workshop. So if you happen to be there, enjoy the time there, definitely check by our booth. There might even be some discounts for NXConf, so definitely check that out. Cool. So yeah, thank you so much, Colum, for coming on the show and live coding through some of that stuff. I think this is very interesting. As I mentioned before, check out our YouTube channel. We have a lot of content there, which goes exactly in this direction. So model federation and walk through step by step on how you can do some refactoring that sense. And so once we have that standalone setup more nailed and in stone, how it works more production ready, we'll definitely have some content around that as well.
Yeah.
So thanks everyone for checking in.
If it helps, I actually reserved the application there now and it worked. So
that's always
it's always the way. But yeah, there's a PR out to add the support for the generators. So keep an eye on all the socials because it will come.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Talk to you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.